Welcome back to Compact Conflows. We are going to talk about forts and fortifications today. So let's start with this. How do you make a fort for a tabletop?
Well, I mean, pretty self-explanatory, man. You look at the types of fortifications available at whichever era you're looking at. Um, as far as actually making it, I'm sure we could do a terrain tutorial to show you guys how to actually build one, but that'll be later in the works. Um, but as far as determining the type and scale, I think you really got to look at the era. You have to look at materials available to commanders, especially if you're looking at a campaign game. What do you think, JT?
Yeah, I agree entirely. And I think this is going to be something that varies wildly depending on the fortification and era, right? Because if you're doing something like Revolutionary War, where you're dealing with readabouts and whatnot, where you have these more wooden-based fortifications to base around, that's something you have to reflect on the tabletop. Or let's say you're going more medieval, and you're thinking more maybe stone forts. You know, these large extended sieges are involved. But just depends on what you're looking at.
Okay. What other kind of fortifications can you make there? I know you kind of mentioned palisades out of just wood, 3D models, stuff you can get offline. What are some other fortification types here?
I think you have more permanent structures such as your earthen fort, stone fort, even wooden fort. And I say like permanent in that we still see a lot of earthen forts. Even from Roman times, right? We still see a little bit of a dirt mound there, and as you progress throughout history, the dirt mounds slowly become forts. There's a lot of earthen forts that are made during the Revolutionary War in the United States that are still easily visible today. So those are your more permanent ones. Now you can have more semi-permanent, like trenches, um, earthworks, breastworks. You're digging up the dirt, throwing it on there, maybe reinforcing it with stakes in the front being abatis, maybe putting wooden backings and wooden planks on the back side of it, kind of make a bit more of a trench or a breastwork. And those are a bit more of your semi-permanent ones that can really be built on the fly. These are ones that you're not going to need specialists like engineers or pioneers to construct. This is something that you can order your men on the ground to do.
Mm-hmm. And I think depending on the scale of time your campaign's going to be in, correct? So to use the Civil War, which I'm a bit more familiar with, your earthwork forts are something that's a lot more reasonable within the scope of that shorter campaign to say, hey, in a couple months, I want to get my guys to make this fort, to have that be something new within the campaign. However, hey, I want a large stone fortification with extensive defensive networks on a coastal area. You can do that. However, you do need to take into account the time span, how long that's going to take. So in a shorter war where maybe it's only a couple month time period you're playing within, that's not something you can do. Whereas for whatever reason, let's say you're doing the 100 Years War, man, you got all the time in the world. You can really plan out and do something like that. Um, but yeah,
Okay. So whenever we're going to the tabletop, should we try to keep the forts more historical, or should we go with made up? Maybe like names. I'm thinking more of a campaign in that aspect. Caleb, any thoughts?
I really think that whenever you're looking at placing forts, especially for campaign on a map, you don't want to oversaturate it. But you want to keep it historical, but you also want to give the players that ability to make those decisions themselves. This is what I do. I look for forts historically before I even start my campaign. I look at forts or highly fortified areas such as towns, right? It doesn't Whenever we're talking about forts or fortifications, we're not purely just talking about Fort Ticonderoga, this unassailable stone fort, right? We're talking about just like a mound of dirt as well. But whenever I'm looking at ones that are already starting off on the campaign map, if I put every single fort that existed during the American Revolutionary War, my map would be covered in forts because you would, you had the initial forts from prior to the war, then you had the forts in the French and Indian War, then you had the forts that were built during the American Revolutionary War. So it's almost layers of forts as the colonies began to spread. So what I do is I find one, forts that were already around during our start date, and two, I find forts that are of big significance and importance. There are several forts, especially on the frontier, that were only designed to hold about 80 men, right? So I'm not going to want to include that on the map. Same thing that I'm not going to include a small little hamlet town of 100 people on the map. So I include just the major forts or areas that I know included forts, like such as Boston, right? There were tons of forts guarding Boston and Philadelphia, so those will be reflected on there. But your little bum in the middle of nowhere fort, I don't do that. But I also want to give the players the opportunity to make the forts themselves, because what use is being a general if you can't do whatever you want on the campaign map, right? So I put enough forts on there so that way, they, of course, they're already there and they can be used and the campaign can revolve around that. But I also give the commanders the opportunity to place their own forts or fortifications or to make them during the campaign. I really want to give them that command decision of them looking at a set of crossroads and being like, yes, this right here definitely needs to be, there definitely needs to be a fort here. I don't know why there isn't already one here. This is dumb. Of course, we need to put one here. So those are the kind of decisions I'm hoping to allow our players to make, especially when they're playing general.
Yeah, just to kind of add on to that, when you're running a campaign, you don't want to force your guys kind of into purely historical one-to-one actions. I mean, if that's the way the player wants to play it, let them do that. But by not allowing them to expand or change their strategy in any way, like, hey, I'm going to build a defensive line here around this important city or around a supply hub that maybe didn't exist during the actual historical events. By not allowing that at all, you're kind of forcing, you're narrowing down their options. Maybe like, hey, I want to attempt to play a more defensive campaign, just let's say Germany World War II for whatever reason. Hey, I have made it into France. Instead of advancing further, I want to dig in. I don't know why you would ever do that, but maybe that's what you want to do. By saying, okay, hey, you can't build any forts, you got to work with what's there, you're shutting down that entire possibility. But it's certainly up to you if you want to say, hey, that's not something they do, so it's not going to be an option. Certainly up to you. But I think to take the players, the generals, initiative out is always the worst option.
Okay, I mean I agree entirely. Is what is their function though on the tabletop? The abattis, the chevet, whatever, because I can't ever pronounce the word. Fortifications,
Chevaux de Frise.
trenches. It's French. It's made up, so it's okay. I don't think any of our viewers are from France. But what is their function on the tabletop? How can we utilize them best?
Yeah, so I can go over a few of them because we've been working on the rules recently, so I kind of have them a little fresh in my mind. So, in our rules, we try to incorporate every type of fortification there was, minus tunneling, because that's kind of difficult to reflect on the tabletop, but maybe we'll find out a method for it eventually. Um, Normally, your fort. Let's talk. Let's talk big scale here. So your fort, whether that be a star or square earthen fort or stone fort or timber fort, those are mainly used to hold strong points, to hold not just tactical but strategic objectives. I know, for instance, in currently our Middle Colonies campaign, we have something called Fort Johns in northern New Jersey, which has become slightly important to both sides because it's controlling the northern axis from New Jersey into eastern Pennsylvania, northeastern Pennsylvania. So, once again, not just tactical, right? This isn't only something you need to worry about because it's on the battle map, but seeing it on the board. Like, whenever I'm looking at a map and I see there's a fort there, I instantly know that this is going to take a lot of time, a lot of effort, a lot of sieges. So that's kind of what forts used for: strong points in important positions, whether, however you identify it or however they're already there whenever you appear. Now, your semi-permanent fortifications, such as breastworks and trenches, those are more temporary for holding, such as your army is marching and you know that they need to rest maybe for a turn to gain replenishment or for a turn to gain supply. Then I'm going to have my army rest here. I'm going to have them erect breastworks. So that way they have some kind of defensive bonus. So the breastworks there are mainly to stop bullets and cannonballs, right? Now, this isn't preventing an enemy from climbing over the top, and it's not going to stop all types of missile infantry from shooting at you. But it adds a additive of protection. And your Abbati, if I'm not mistaken, the Abbati is more to slow down advancing infantry and cavalry. It's kind of like your kind of think as barbed wire, World War I barbed wire. That's kind of what your Abbati is. It's there to slow the enemy advance. That way you can cut them to pieces as they come onto your position. We haven't used trenches too much, but trenches are kind of that sweet spot of the breastwork. It's a bit more permanent, a lot more defensible. I would say a little bit more difficult to get out once you have been infiltrated in the trench, because now you have to fight your way out of your own trench. Whereas breastwork, all you have to do is withdraw. And then Chevaux de Frise, of course, is purely an anti-cavalry obstacle. It's perfect for funneling in enemy cavalry, same as Abbati for infantry. The Chevaux de Frise is perfect. Either the cavalry go around it or they die, pretty much. I think you have to roll a 6 in order for the cavalry to get through that thing completely unaffected. JT, can you think of any other obstacles or fortifications that we use in our game?
I mean, I'll be honest. You kind of hit everything. I mean, it's. I hesitate to say it's simple, but at least I kind of feel like it is. It's exactly as you sign it up to be. You are creating obstacles for the enemy, however that may appear. Whether that's a moat to slow them down, a wall so they can't, so they have to go over or through. You kind of really hit all the details there, so that not much else I can add there.
Nice.
Well, good job. So we kind of talked about sieges in the last episode with logistics and whatnot, but going to forts and tying them into logistics and sieges on forts, how does that all play in together on the big campaign map and even in the battle itself?
JT, you want to handle that?
Yeah, sieges. I like a good siege. Uh, when it comes to fortifications, they're very important, especially with the whole dealing with them, as you can imagine. Uh, it looks a little different throughout the eras, of course. Like for a Rev War campaign, right? You're not having people with ladders trying to scale walls or trebuchets or nothing like that, of course. But you do have to ask the question of how am I going to handle these various defenses, right? You mentioned earlier anti-cavalry defensive options. Hey, is that something I'm gonna have to try and go around or build something to avoid having to deal with, or is it? Do you just accept, hey, I'm not going to be able to use my cavalry, so maybe I use my cavalry, but they're all dismounted. Um, it's something to take into account. You start the question placements of your bombardment, right? What's the best way I can inflict maximum damage upon the person being sieged, without exposing myself to any sort of counterattack? Um, but depends on how much you want to detail that. But sieging can be a little detail oriented. But yeah.
Yeah, that's some really good points there. I think when talking about sieges, and we can talk about sieges on cities, of course, but really sieges on forts, they normally don't last too long because the fort is there to guard something, and you can completely nullify the fort, which, I mean, we definitely do a video on how to break fortifications as the attacker for sure. But when it comes to forts, it's either going to be quick, it's going to be very short, or it's going to take very long. I know that in our 96, the fort at 96 in our Southern Colonies campaign, I came upon this fort and I knew it was going to be very bloody to take it. So then I just ordered my sub commanders to just go ahead and encircle it. And as they started to encircle it, the rebels inside the fort realized that, and they just skedaddled out of the fort. That we didn't even have to fight for the walls because they were afraid of being boxed in and starving into surrender. So when it comes to sieges, you can blast it away. It just depends. Do you want that fort intact, or do you just want to destroy its significance? Is your goal to capture what is inside the fort? I think all these are factors that kind of change how a general decides to attack. If my goal is just to seize this area and I don't have a time crunch, I'm just going to sit there. I'm just going to starve them out. If my goal is to hurry up and seize these crossroads now to allow freedom of maneuver for a larger force, then I might do a rapid bombardment and then a full-on frontal assault. So I think sieges on forts can go any number of different ways. You just have to take time into consideration. You have to take enemy combat power into consideration. And you have to take your overall objective in consideration while sieging a fort, because all those factors could change up the dynamic of the siege for sure. We've had some that lasted. I think me and you, Nick, we were going to attack 96. We thought we were going to be there for a bit. It only took 2 turns before the fort fell into our hands, and then there was another game where I'm sieging a fort outside of, I think it was Charleston, for 15 turns. So all these factors is what can kind of change up the siege on a fort.
You mentioned Charleston, so what about port city forts? You're kind of more sieging the city there whenever you're trying to get that port fort for naval bombardment, etc. Is that change anything for siegers of fort, or pretty much the same tactics?
I think, yeah. I mean, unless JT has anything on that, I think the only thing that really changes would really just be now you have the naval aspect at your disposal when it comes to taking care of that fort.
I think it opens up a avenue that otherwise doesn't. Like I said, it's naval, so everything that comes with naval is now involved, and that can completely change an interaction. Where it can be a case of, hey, I'm so confident in my naval capabilities that I think I can take this port city, even if I were just to march, even if I don't think I can take it just via land, or vice versa. To think, hey, I can hold it via land, but frankly, my navy can't hold up. And kind of having this port city's a liability because I know they're going to rock up with a bunch of boats and just kind of blow me to smithereens. And so it does definitely provide a different level of threat and stuff to take care of that if you're not careful about it can bite you in the butt.
That very more complex operation, in my opinion, because I know there was a coastal fort outside of Charleston, South Carolina, called Fort Sullivan, and of course I couldn't get my troops around it because they're bombarding and surrounding the actual city of Charleston. But in order for my ships to get into Charleston's harbor, I would either have to run the guns at Fort Sullivan, which would have been crazy because they would have got blown up, or I would have had to attack Fort Sullivan. But then it kind of comes to the idea, okay, well, how can I take a fort on an island when all my troops are occupied? Then the idea popped in my mind, what about the Marines? So then I brought all the Marines together from the fleet, and I had a really long talk with the umpire. I rolled pretty high on the D20, and he allowed it. And for 5 turns, he kept rolling the D20 to see if my boys rode up in the middle of the night on Fort Sullivan. And we caught a battalion of South Carolinian line unawares, and we stormed the fort and took that. But that's an instance where a fort falls purely from the seaside. My land forces had nothing to do with that. So I really think that port city forts, that there is a different realm of war in that aspect for sure.
Okay. Is how do you incorporate all this into the campaign though? So if I'm hunkered down in a city or I've got a region, what have you, depending on the war, how do you combine that in to the campaign to be like, hey, on this road leading into Paris, I want abattis and the other French word that makes no sense. I want them there because I want to funnel the enemy into this fatal funnel. How would that work into the campaign, though?
Chevaux de flee, chevaux de flee. Yeah. Now, I think a really good way to make it work is the players. This is really the fun of an umpire, right? This is kind of the fun of being a player too. Is that the player looks at the map and they decide what is important. And there's been plenty of times where I, as the umpire, see the player doing something. I'm like, ooh, I would not do that. But I kind of have that, that hindsight with knowing where both forces are. But it's something. It's nice when a player looks at the umpire and they kind of have that aha moment seeing a crossroads on the map and they know, this crossroads is going to be important later in the campaign. And they decide to build fortifications there. I know you, Nick, in some previous campaigns, a city will most certainly come under attack. I think it was during Boston or New England campaign. You knew that city was going to be attacked, so you began stockpiling provisions
I did
there
in the
to
fort.
last a siege of at least like 6 months. And you said, I want my boys picking up a shovel every single day for the next 6 months. And they had the fortifications that reflected that.
Yeah.
So I think that's a really good way to incorporate that, allowing that player to get a little fun with it. Because the player is just like, yeah, throw a fort there. I mean, the umpire can interpret that anyway. So I know how we've done it is that if you're not precise with your orders, the umpire likes to screw you. Because if you're like, oh, I want some fortifications here, and then battle comes around and it's like one set of stakes and a small breastwork, and he's like, well, here's some of your fortifications you asked for.
Here's your two
Yeah.
fences. Good luck.
Yeah, for
Is
sure.
so then the last one is what if we're just going to do an arcade battle? Is do you want to be as historically accurate, or is it just going to be up to shooter's choice at that point? But how would you incorporate the fortifications and fort into an arcade type battle?
Mm. I would
I
say, go ahead, JT.
I'd say that's entirely up to the arcade battle situation, right? Um, if you want to go uber historical, like I know it's probably, oh man, they say the same thing over and over again. It's whatever you want, but I think it's absolutely, if you want to say, hey, I want to see what happens if we make the most meat grindery defensive fortifications possible. I want to see how many guys you need to run down this gauntlet to like get through. Or hey, I want to use this historical fort that had weaknesses or wasn't really effective or whatever. You can certainly do either or, and I think that's kind of the fun though of especially when you're the ones getting to make up the battlefield, right? At the end of the day, you're putting it together with whatever you have, because you're never going to get like an exact 1-to-1, of course, but sometimes having that bit of jank in it makes it more entertaining.
I I really like that idea, JT, of the meat grinder. I know we talked the other day about maybe setting up a battle where we have all the militia that we have in our collection and just throw them at a small regiment. So like 5,000 versus 300. I think that'd be a cool and fun scenario. But no, I completely agree. I'm along that same vein where historical is sometimes cooler than the fantasy. I think if you're looking at a battle, you need to scale your fortifications to how many troops you have. If you're doing 1-to-1 like how we do, then if you look at a battle and it says half the troops there were in dug in entrenchments, then on your board, half of your troops should be in dug in entrenchments. Um, I wouldn't say unless the scenario is specific, like JT was talking about, like a zombie apocalypse scenario. I wouldn't say don't make the fortifications inassailable. Don't make it impossible. Maybe leave a certain point of the line a little weaker on the fortifications, right? Forcing the enemy to put more troops there. Kind of like the Alamo, right? There are points in the Alamo which were literal stone and brick, and there were points in the Alamo where it's just piled on logs, right? So they had to adjust their security and where they're placing troops to meet that. I think there's a lot to do in scenario battles, if not arcade battles. And I would say any umpire or club starting out really needs to take advantage of the arcade or scenario battles to test out their fortifications. For sure. You need to use that as a way to see how you balance it. Because we've been working on our rule book for almost 5 years now, and we are just now finishing or starting to finish our homebrew set. And it took us a long, long time to figure out the balance between historically accurate fortifications and what just looks cool in the movie Fortifications.
Well, alrighty. That's all the questions I have. Any last thoughts?
No.
I like it. Alrighty. Until next time.
That's it for today's episode. For battles, brushes, and everything in between, make sure you subscribe and join the community. Until next time, Generals, see you on the tabletop.